Hi, Journey Groups. So good to be with you again. I hope that your Journey Group meeting has gone pretty well so far. It's been a good thing. I just want to let you know how much I appreciate Journey Groups, how much I appreciate all you're doing, and how you are very much participating in the vision of Bakersfield First Church, being present in the community around us. And so thank you so much for everything that you're doing. Today we're looking at the Dig Deeper section of this week's Journey Group lesson. We're going to be looking specifically at the question of identity as it's related to the question of sanctification. Sanctification is a big theological word that we use. If you've been hanging around the Church of the Nazarene for any amount of time, you've probably heard this word before, and so we're going to talk a little bit more about that in depth tonight. I want to draw our attention specifically to a passage that we've looked at. You should have already read this together, but looking a little more with a little more focus, starting at verse 16 in Ephesians chapter 3. Here's how Paul phrases it. I pray that out of his glorious riches he may strengthen you with power through his Spirit in your inner being, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith. And I pray that you, being rooted and established in love, may have power, together with all the Lord's people, to grasp how wide and long and high and deep is the love of Christ, and to know that this love that surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled to the measure of all the fullness of God. That you may be filled to the measure of all the fullness of God. We're going to focus on that particular phrase in verse 19 today, but I need to back up before we do that and establish a little bit of a connection between sanctification and identity. In the passage we already read, Paul begins in verse 15 or 16, somewhere in there, of talking about kneeling before the Father. He says, "For this reason I kneel before the Father, who establishes or gives the name to every family that is on heaven and on earth." And so there's already this sense in which Paul is kneeling before the Father. There's a kind of a submission that's going on in that particular passage, where Paul isn't saying that I stand beside the Father, I stand over the Father. I kneel before the Father. I submit myself to the Father. And then he begins to go on talking about the church, especially the church in Ephesians, being rooted and established in love. And finally, he concludes the passage by talking about being filled with all the fullness of Christ. So what does all of this mean for us? How does this connect in terms of identity and sanctification? Here's what I want to dig into a little bit deeper tonight, is to really look at this idea of kneeling and this identity of being filled with all the fullness of God as those specific ideas that form within us the Christian identity. You see, you and I cannot be rooted and established in love if we are not first kneeling before the Father. If we are not filled with all the fullness of God, then there's no way that we have a hope of being rooted and established in love. But being rooted and established in love is the primary identity of those who are in the church. Paul talks at the very beginning of Ephesians in chapter 1, we looked at this a few weeks ago, that all things are being brought to unity under Christ. That Christ has authority over all things, and in that authority, because Christ has authority over all things, there's a unity that's being brought to all things at the same time. And the church participates in that unity. If we jump ahead to Revelation chapter 21 and 22, we see that there is this unity that's brought to all things when everyone is kneeling before the Father. And so there's a deep connection here between what's going on in Ephesians, what's going on in Genesis, what's going on in Revelation, and it all has to do with this being rooted and established in love. But here's what I want to suggest to you tonight, is that you and I don't have the capability of being rooted and established in love without sanctification. In other words, unless we are being filled with all the fullness of God, the way that Wesley used to talk about this is that God's love so fills the heart that it excludes sin. It excludes animosity. It excludes all the desires of our hearts that would want to put us at war with one another. And so all the bitterness and anger and infighting that we sometimes have experienced in the church has no place in the sanctified life according to Wesley. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't disagree with one another. we can certainly disagree with one another, and there's a process that we have of going through discernment and chewing on issues together and talking through issues together. It doesn't mean that we just kind of never disagree with one another, but that we always disagree with one another by hanging on in love to one another. So when Paul talks here about being filled with all the fullness of God, it's very close to what Wesley understood as the sanctified life, that we are so filled with God's Spirit that it doesn't leave room for anything else. And that the filling of that Spirit begins to transform us to allow us to do things that we were never capable of doing before God's Spirit began to fill us. Maybe you've had an experience like that before, where you were in a situation that you didn't know how you were going to handle. There was no way that you could have possibly handled that. Maybe you even said a prayer, and you could definitely sense that there was a specific time when God's Spirit began to minister to you, and it created something within you that you didn't have on your own. In other words, it made you capable of doing something that you weren't capable of doing before. And that's what Wesley talks about in terms of sanctification, that we are capable of loving one another, that we are capable of being reconciled to one another, that we're capable of laying down feelings of animosity, of hurt, of not forgiving one another, and that we are, as we are sanctified, as we are filled with the fullness of God, that in that process we are made capable of being reconciled to one another. And so the identity of Christians as those who are being rooted and established in love comes from being filled with all the fullness of God. And being filled with all the fullness of God is not something that you and I can reach out and grasp. It comes, and I love this visual, from kneeling before the Father. Kneeling before the Father. It's an act of submission. It's an act of saying that my identity is not one that I will create on my own. That many times, I think as modern people, we are deeply tempted to try to create our own identity, to say that I will make myself be whoever I want to be. But that's not the identity of the Christian. What we see in Ephesians chapter 3 is that our identity as those who are being rooted and established in love can only come to us as we kneel before the Father and we take a posture of submission rather than one of trying to construct our own identity. And then when we are kneeling before the Father, it is made possible for us to be filled with all the fullness of God. Filled with all the fullness of God, so that we can truly be the people who are rooted and established in love. So that's the connection. That we, unless we are living unto sanctification, that we can't be the kinds of people who are rooted and established in love. We can't try hard enough. We can't employ enough strategies or claw at love enough to be able to be the people who are truly rooted and established in love. That comes as a gift of God, as we kneel before the Father and we are brought to unity under Christ. That is how we can be the people who are rooted and established in love. Your identity is to be a people rooted and established in love. But before we can do that, your task is to kneel before the Father so that you may be filled with all the fullness of God. Let's talk a little bit more. You have some study questions there in front of you. Your guides will take you through that. Thank you so much. We love you, and we'll see you soon.